At its height, the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, lasted more than 1,000 years, outliving its Western counterpart by nearly a millennium. But how did an empire that supposedly fell in Rome reinvent itself and rise again on the shores of the Bosporus? And why did a new capital, built by Constantine, become the true heir to Roman power? In this documentary, we'll explore the political crises, strategic geography, and religious transformations that shaped this new empire. We'll examine how Diocletian's reforms, the failure of the Tetrarchy, and the Edict of Milan set the stage for Constantinople's creation. Along the way, we'll encounter sieges, theological disputes, imperial reforms, and the long arc that carried the empire from its golden age under Justinian to its final stand in 1453. But before we get started, if you're excited to learn more about the rise and resilience of the Byzantine Empire, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments which chapter of this documentary interests you most. The 3rd century opened with Roman authority spread thin and confidence shattered. Emperors rose and fell through barracks coups. Frontier legions fought each other as often as they faced enemies. In the provinces, coinage lost credibility, taxes became harder to collect, and merchants hoarded goods. Goths crossed the Danube, Franks probed the Rhine, and in the east, the revived Persian state tested Roman defenses. Cities fortified their walls and watched caravans reroute. The empire still called itself one realm, but it felt like a chain of regions held together by habit and fear more than by policy. Out of that landscape stepped a career soldier from the Balkans, Diocletian, whose path ran through camps and frontier headquarters rather than Rome's salons. He treated the chaos as a management problem. The state needed predictable command, regular revenue, and clear lines between civil and military authority. He redrew provincial borders to shrink oversized jurisdictions, raised the number of governors, and put supervisors above them to audit performance. He separated generals from taxmen and sent inspectors to test both. The message was steady. Roles, ranks, and routines would anchor power. The scale of the map forced his next move. Communication lag and distance meant a single court could not react fast enough to handle the Rhine, the Danube, and the Euphrates at once. Diocletian appointed a partner as co-emperor, and then 2 deputies to shadow them. The Tetrarchy mapped a human solution onto geography: 2 senior Augusti with 2 junior Caesares, each with a field of operation, its own capital, and its own staff. Edicts issued with joint names signaled unity, while files and courtiers worked in parallel. In practice, the arrangement recognized an administrative east and west without admitting a legal split. Each half had its treasury centers, arsenals, and itinerant courts. Yet the system claimed a single Roman order with coordinated policy, shared legitimacy, and a common lawmaking voice. Coin portraits, titles, and ceremonies presented a synchronized hierarchy so provincial officials could read the chain of command. The eastern half benefited from where its assets lay. Syria and Egypt funneled cash crops and customs into imperial accounts. Urban networks around Antioch, Alexandria, and the cities of Asia Minor supported workshops, shipping, and courts. The Danube and the Taurus ranges offered lines of defense that, when maintained with roads and depots, could be supplied from nearby hubs. Meanwhile, in much of the West, large estates spread, towns thinned, and defense lines stretched across larger frontiers with weaker fiscal depth. To keep soldiers paid and files moving, Diocletian standardized requisitions, linked labor obligations to land, and stabilized tax assessments with new surveys. He bolstered fort lines with fortified posts and staged forces to answer raids. Recruitment tied families to service through land-for-duty arrangements in frontier zones. These measures built a bureaucracy with habits strong enough to endure the careers of several emperors. Culture and politics followed the grain of language. Latin remained the law's voice and the army's orders in many regions, but Greek dominated the marketplaces and municipal offices of the East. Courts closer to Nicomedia and Antioch worked through Greek-speaking clerks and notaries, while Western elites kept Roman senatorial customs alive. The result was smoother administration in the East and deeper friction across the empire's cultural seam. New centers rose to match these realities. Nicomedia housed an imperial court with archives, treasuries, and workshops. Antioch managed eastern campaigns and taxation. Plans for greater investment along the Bosporus hinted at a future pivot that would later crystallize at Constantinople. In 305, Diocletian stepped down by choice, setting a precedent no emperor had dared. He left behind a playbook of divided labor and concentrated oversight that others would inherit and struggle to control. When crisis returned and envoys asked him to rule again, he stayed with his garden. Constantine entered power with a different goal than patching a failing center. He wanted a capital that could signal a reset, a Roman state with enough reach to govern armies and commerce across 2 continents. Rome had prestige, but its politics ran through old senatorial networks, its urban fabric strained under decline, and it sat far from the fiscal engines in the East. Constantine needed distance from those bottlenecks and a vantage point that could direct grain, gold, and men with fewer delays. He found it in Byzantium, a compact Greek city guarding the narrow waters where the Black Sea meets the Mediterranean. The site controlled traffic like a gatekeeper. Any fleet leaving the Pontic harbors funneled past its shores. Caravans from Anatolia and Thrace converged there before roads fanned out again. Naval squadrons could pivot north to the Danube or south to the Levant with speed. The geography sold itself: deep harbors, elevated promontories, and a shoreline that forced attackers onto predictable ground. Constantine did not settle for a fortified camp. He rewrote the urban plan. Crews extended the city's walls to enclose more hills and neighborhoods, laid new avenues, and concentrated power into ceremonial spaces. Forums framed with colonnades held markets and imperial proclamations. Palaces and administrative halls pulled the court into daily view of the populace. New aqueducts spanned the hinterland to secure water for a larger population and garrisons. Above it all, the Hippodrome became a civic engine, part stadium, part political theater, where factions, petitions, and imperial presence met in one arena. He branded the project as a new Rome, but not a copy. The institutions of empire, prefects, a senate, magistracies, took their seats in a city whose language and habits leaned Greek. Christian churches rose alongside state buildings, including a burial church for emperors at the Church of the Holy Apostles. Processions tied the calendar of governance to the calendar of worship. The court and the episcopate developed routines that taught subjects how power would look and sound in the new order. Defense shaped every decision. Water ringed the peninsula on 3 sides, and shipyards lined the Golden Horn to keep fleets ready. Along the land approach, space remained to add massive fortifications as the city grew, a plan that future rulers realized with multi-layer walls, towers, and a moat. Supply lines by sea cushioned sieges. Grain boats could slip into the sheltered harbor even when land routes failed. The capital's logistics were built to outlast pressure. Constantine treated the city like a museum of empire and a workshop for legitimacy. Artisans set up foundries and mints. Statues, columns, and monuments arrived from every corner. Pieces of older cities repurposed to state that the old world now spoke through this one. Pagan masterpieces stood not as worship, but as statements of rank and heritage. The effect was immediate. Merchants followed demand, scholars sought patronage, and pilgrims visited shrines that linked faith to authority. The change rippled through the map. Treasury flows pivoted toward the Bosporus. Eastern provinces found shorter lines to court and contract. Governors oriented cases and petitions eastward. Over time, the gravitational pull of Constantinople locked in an eastern trajectory for imperial policy and military planning. Stories later claimed Constantine sealed a fragment of the true cross and other relics under his commemorative column, a gesture tying the city's foundation to a sacred trust that, for a millennium, shaped its purpose and confidence. Constantine's public identity began in the world of traditional cults and imperial rites, but his politics moved in a new direction after civil war thrust him to the center of power. As he consolidated authority, the gap between his early affiliations and his later policies widened. He did not announce a sudden conversion so much as stage a series of choices that tied his rule to Christian communities, bishops, and symbols that carried a different moral authority than Rome's older gods. By the time his new capital rose on the Bosporus, the ruler who once sacrificed at imperial altars now treated churches as pillars of the state. The hinge came with the Milvian Bridge campaign in 312 against Maxentius. Accounts describe a vision before battle and a sign that he linked to the Christian God. He ordered his soldiers to mark their equipment with a Christian emblem and marched into a fight that ended with his rival dead and his own position secured. For Constantine, the outcome validated the decision to align power with the faith's protective sign. It also introduced a political language that framed victories as evidence of divine backing, rather than personal fortune or civic rituals. From that point, policy followed belief. In 313, he and Licinius issued measures known as the Edict of Milan, granting legal freedom to worship across the empire and returning confiscated property to Christian communities. The state no longer prosecuted Christians for their assemblies or scriptures. Instead, governors received instructions to facilitate restitution. The framework reduced legal friction, opened the doors of administration to Christian advisors, and cleared the way for imperial gifts to churches. Imperial patronage then built a visible map of the new order. Constantine endowed bishops with estates, funded clergy, and channeled imperial resources into monumental projects. He commissioned large basilicas where crowds would gather and where the court could display presence at major feasts. In Jerusalem, construction centered on the site honored as the place of Jesus' death and resurrection. In Rome, a vast church rose near the graves of martyrs. These buildings did more than host worship. They anchored pilgrimage, drew craftsmen, and turned sacred sites into engines of urban revival. Unity, however, required doctrine. Disputes over how to speak about Christ's nature threatened to splinter communities across provinces. In 325, Constantine convened bishops at Nicaea under imperial auspices. They produced a creed that set boundaries for teaching and liturgy. The emperor enforced the council's decisions with exile orders and correspondence that treated theological clarity as a matter of public order. Church and state began to share tools, summonses, archives, and provincial networks to maintain common norms. The result was a ruler who governed as much through ritual and council as through edict and army. He kept the legal machinery of Rome while weaving Christian times, symbols, and institutions into it. Artists borrowed Christian themes for imperial monuments. Laws drew on bishops as arbiters in disputes. Identities stretched. Soldiers, notaries, mid-level officials, and city councils learned to recognize Christian festivals and processions as part of civic life. The empire gained a new vocabulary of legitimacy. Constantine delayed baptism until the end of his life, a choice that fit late antique practice while preserving flexibility as he managed a diverse population. Meanwhile, patrons reallocated wealth toward the church. Sources speak of temple treasuries and endowments redirected to Christian foundations, effectively moving precious metals, land income, and artistic labor into a new institutional core. In doing so, he tied prosperity and piety together, and he set expectations that future emperors would legislate, build, and defend in the name of the Christian Commonwealth. When Theodosius I died in 395, the imperial seal split for good. He had kept the map under one hand. His sons inherited halves. The Western court shuffled between Milan and Ravenna, increasingly defensive and reactive. The East stayed anchored to Constantinople, where treasuries, fleets, and archives concentrated. From that year forward, cooperation depended on diplomacy, not command. The Western half struggled to pay soldiers and hold allies. Tax arrears mounted as estates absorbed small farms, coinage lost reach in the countryside, and officials relied more on in-kind requisitions that bred evasion and resentment. Power drifted to generals and court favorites who rotated through short, brittle regimes. Federate contingents, Visigoths, Vandals, and others, received land or subsidies in exchange for service, but those deals frayed under arrears and mistrust. The frontier became a negotiation booth rather than a line. Across the Balkans and in Gaul, local governors faced marching groups who wanted secure settlement more than plunder, yet clashes erupted when promises failed. The sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric's Visigoths showed the limits of Western coordination. An iconic city with little strategic value suffered because mediation collapsed. 2 decades later, the Vandals crossed into North Africa and cut into the Western tax base by taking the provinces that supplied oil, grain, and customs revenue. In 429, their foothold became a pipeline of ships and fighters that the West could not dislodge. By contrast, the Eastern Empire leaned on dense urban networks and a tighter fiscal core. Alexandria, Antioch, and the cities of Asia Minor kept artisans, shipyards, and courts alive. Constantinople's bureaucracy standardized procedures, audited governors, and maintained mint output that paid garrisons on schedule. Fortification programs in Thrace and around the capital funneled attackers into prepared zones. The capital's sea lanes ensured grain deliveries when land routes failed. And its diplomatic corps bought time with payments and treaties that cost less than wars. As the West faltered, the East adopted the role of custodian of Roman civilization. Law schools compiled and interpreted imperial rescripts. Court ceremony hardened into a script that taught subjects what sovereignty looked like. Libraries and scribal workshops preserved texts and commentaries. Even as provincial losses mounted in the West, Constantinople hosted triumphs, processions, and legal sessions that reinforced continuity. The Western unraveling accelerated through mid-century. North Africa's loss starved Ravenna of money. Armies in Gaul and Italy fought civil wars that emptied ranks needed for defense. Generals sought legitimacy by controlling puppet emperors, but each turnover bled authority. In 476, a commander named Odoacer deposed the young Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople. Western administration did not vanish overnight. Local officials and kings repurposed Roman tools. Still, the Western title went dark. Eastern emperors refused to treat the West as gone. They addressed new rulers as officials, not equals, and framed former Western provinces as temporarily out of hand. In Constantinople, the idea of a single empire persisted, with the Bosporus city acting as the real new Rome. Its courts issued laws in Latin for a time, then increasingly in Greek as language habits shifted. Churches aligned liturgy and doctrine with imperial policy, and religious identity deepened around the capital's bishops and monasteries. The separation brought an odd benefit to the East. Without Western liabilities, endless Rhine campaigns subsidizing failing administrations, propping up distant courts, the Eastern budget focused on its own frontiers and fleets. Over the next centuries, that focus helped it adapt and survive. And when word reached the Bosporus that an Italian strongman had dismissed a boy emperor, many residents did not pause their day. For them, Rome lived where the emperor sat, under the gold and purple of Constantinople. Justinian entered the palace with a goal that reached beyond routine governance. He wanted Rome restored in substance, not ceremony, a Mediterranean map stitched back together under one authority. He cultivated the image of a successor to Caesar and Augustus, yet he approached the task like a systems engineer, aligning courts, armies, and clergy toward a single center of command. The claim was straightforward. The empire had been damaged, not destroyed, and Constantinople held the tools to repair it. His time came with a memory of distance from power. Born in the Balkans to a peasant family, he rose through the ranks because his uncle, Justin, clawed his way to the throne and pulled his nephew into the capital. That background sharpened Justinian's appetite for legitimacy. He read dossiers, corrected memoranda, and kept secretaries working through the night. His schedule told officials what to expect: no slack, no ambiguity, and no tolerance for offices that treated imperial rules as suggestion. Inside government, his method was consolidation. He pruned overlapping bureaus, promoted trusted aides, and pushed for uniform procedures across provinces. He tightened oversight of tax rolls and procurement to keep armies supplied without handing leverage to provincial magnates. He used imperial edicts to define what judges could accept as precedent and how appeals should flow upward. The center would write the language. The provinces would speak it. That impulse culminated in the Codex Justinianus, the first stage of a larger legal project that gathered centuries of statutes and rulings into an organized whole. Teams of jurists sifted through contradictions, struck obsolete clauses, and arranged texts so governors and advocates could actually apply them. The result gave courts a common reference and made imperial will legible from North Africa to the Danube. Over later centuries, that corpus shaped legal thinking far beyond the empire's shrinking borders. His eye moved from law to stone. Building programs announced theology and power at ground level. He He funded churches, hospitals, and administrative halls, and he planned urban spaces to choreograph processions between palace and sanctuary. Architecture served as a statement. The ruler governed by God's favor, and the city's skyline should teach it. After the capital convulsed in violent unrest, he commissioned a new cathedral on a scale that outstripped memory. Hagia Sophia's vast canopy spread over a light-filled nave, its dome seeming to hover above a ring of windows that dissolved weight into brilliance. It became the visual shorthand for Byzantine confidence and technical mastery. Beyond the capital, Justinian gambled on force. He aimed first at North Africa, where restoring tax flows promised quick returns, and then at Italy, where the old administrative heartlands carried symbolic weight. He relied on agile commanders and fleets to break enemies quickly before fatigue and distance drained momentum. Each campaign demanded pay, ships, and siege equipment. Each success required garrisons, governors, and subsidies to hold the ground. The costs mounted. Diplomacy on the eastern frontier had to keep Persia quiet while Western armies marched. Revenues from reconquered lands lagged behind expectations, and local wars outlasted optimistic timetables. The emperor pressed on, convinced that risk today secured order tomorrow. He remained a figure of contradictions, visionary in scope, uncompromising in method, pious in purpose, and stark in the burdens he imposed. Through all of it, one partner shaped outcomes inside the palace and in the streets. Theodora's counsel and resolve made policy possible when events threatened to unmake it, and her stance soon met its trial. Justinian, for his part, never called his realm anything but Rome, reborn under a new capital and an old claim. On race days, the Hippodrome pulled the city into one cauldron. Tens of thousands watched teams whip around the Spina while petitions, jeers, and chants rolled down from the tiers. Officials appeared in the imperial box to read edicts. Courtiers exchanged signals. Beneath the spectacle, grievances circulated as fast as wagers. The arena doubled as a forum where loyalty could be measured in noise and discontent could harden into pressure. Those crowds sorted themselves into blues and green. The labels came from colors on the charioteers' tunics, but the factions ran through neighborhoods, guilds, and patronage. They funded racers and stables, but also lawyers and street enforcers. Local leaders could use them to deliver votes, raise donations, or stage demonstration. Rivalries spilled beyond sport, and fights sometimes bled into markets and church squares. Magistrates had to manage not just crime, but coalition politics wrapped in team banners. By 532, the fiscal edge of Justinian's program cut into many groups at once. Tax collectors pressed arrears. New audits closed loopholes that elites had long enjoyed. Merchants took losses when monopolies tightened and price controls snapped. Small shopkeepers faced inspectors, while municipal councils fielded orders without funds to comply. The reforms promised order, but the pace bred resentment. Faction clashes offered a spark near a pile of dry wood. An arrest after a street brawl became the fuse that set everything off. Executions set for several offenders were botched, and survivors fled to a sanctuary. Blues and greens, for once, found common cause, demand clemency, denounce corrupt officials, and push back against the fiscal squeeze. When the emperor refused to yield, the Hippodrome erupted. "Nika! Nika!" roared from the stands as the crowd called for victory over the palace, not the rival team. Fires leapt from quarter to quarter. Market halls, baths, and the old cathedral went up in smoke. For days, the city's core turned into barricades and ash. Inside the palace, panic spread. Advisors urged flight to the harbors where ships awaited. The sense in the corridors was that rule had slipped, and any delay risked entrapment. She had already shown a talent for reading crowds and courts. Her resolve cut through the fear, and the room recalibrated around a plan to retake the city rather than abandon it. Orders went to the generals. Units fanned through streets to isolate pockets of resistance, while Belisarius and the guards set a trap at the Hippodrome. With promises and threats, they drew rebels inside for a supposed negotiation. Gates shut. Armed lines advanced from both ends. The crush turned into slaughter. When the killing stopped, tens of thousands lay dead, and the revolt ended in one blow that scarred Constantinople for years. The aftermath changed the balance inside the regime. Theodora emerged as a co-architect of policy. Petitioners learned that access to her could decide cases, and officials adjusted to a two-voiced court. Laws soon reflected her priorities, provisions that strengthened women's ability to initiate divorce, secure dowries, hold property independently, and resist coercion in brothels. These measures moved through the same machinery that had tightened taxes months earlier, but now the targets were predators and the loopholes that shielded them. Work crews cleared rubble, cut new fire breaks, and reopened aqueducts. The emperor committed resources to rebuild at a scale that would overwrite the memory of ash. Plans for a new cathedral exceeded anything the city had seen, and the site of loss became the stage for a statement in stone and light. In the Hippodrome, meanwhile, factions returned to racing under heavy surveillance, and briefly, even they acknowledged how close they had come to replacing the emperor inside that very arena. Belisarius first appeared as the kind of commander court rivals underestimate. Young, spare in speech, exacting with drill. He trained composite armies, Byzantine regulars, Belisari household cavalry, and allied Hunnic horse archers into units that could move quickly and hit harder than their numbers suggested. Reports of his early frontier fights against Persians showcased a habit of staging ambushes with mobile wings and keeping a disciplined infantry corps to hold ground. Justinian saw in him a tool for a larger plan. That plan aimed at the Western map. If the empire could bring back key provinces, tax revenue and prestige would follow. North Africa offered the clearest opening. The Vandal kingdom controlled Carthage, the grain route, and shipyards that once supplied Roman fleets. Italy promised higher symbolism, Rome, Ravenna, and the old administrative spine, but also hard fighting. Justinian chose Africa first to prove the model and fund the rest. In 533, Belisarius sailed from Constantinople with a compact expedition. A few tens of thousands of men, strong in cavalry, carried by a fleet assembled under tight secrecy and stricter contracts for supplies. He landed near Caput Vada, kept the march disciplined to avoid alienating locals, and met the Vandals in two decisive encounters. At Ad Decimum, he used flexible cavalry screens to blunt a larger force and turned a near disaster into a routed enemy. Soon after, at Tricomarum, he pressed the advantage before the Vandal command recovered. Within months, Carthage opened its gates and imperial administration resumed. The speed shocked observers. Warehouses reopened, the mint struck coins with imperial portraits, and officials audited estates that had shifted hands under Vandal rule. Belisarius sent captured regalia and prisoners to Constantinople, signaling that the province and its customs dues were back in the imperial column. Garrisons spread along the coast, and naval patrols secured sea lanes. For a moment, the Reconquest looked efficient, almost procedural. Italy did not. In 535, the army crossed to Sicily, secured ports, and then moved on to the peninsula. Belisarius entered Rome in 536, re-establishing an imperial presence inside its walls for the first time in decades. The Gothic War that followed dragged year after year. Sieges cut aqueducts and emptied granaries. Populations fled to fortified hill towns. Fields went fallow, workshops closed, and tax collectors found ruins where ledgers had listed households. Disease and famine shadowed both armies. Belisarius kept working with the tools he trusted: mobility, intelligence networks, and restrained treatment of civilians. Cities sometimes surrendered when he guaranteed property and lives, a policy that saved walls and won allies. Yet the court grew nervous about his standing with soldiers and local elites. At critical moments, Justinian recalled him or split his command, pushing him to accept triumphs at home while momentum slipped abroad. Supplies arrived late, reinforcements came in fragments, and rival generals diluted authority. Even with those limits, the general's record was solid. Ravenna capitulated after a campaign of pressure and negotiation that opened the gates without a storm. Large stretches of Italy returned to imperial colors, but holding them proved expensive. Paymasters scraped coins from a strained treasury. Requisitions fed garrisons but starved town markets. The countryside's loss of labor and livestock shrank revenue just as defense needs spiked. In the end, the map improved on parchment more than in practice. Africa stabilized, though not without revolts. Italy became a ledger of grains offset by exhaustion. The empire carried the weight of new frontiers, while its core faced rising costs and thin reserves. Belisarius remained the loyal instrument, even when sidelined, his restraint a rare constant in a brutal war. Later storytellers would claim he died blindsided and begging, a likely fiction that captured a truth about the era. Glory came freighted with risk, and reward rarely matched service. Soon, a different kind of foe would test all those gains at once. The story turns from campaigns to disease. After years of rebuilding the capital, codifying law, and marching armies west, the empire met a silent invader. In 541, a pandemic arrived that later generations would connect to the same bacterium behind the medieval Black Death. The suddenness mattered. One shipping season, life ran on familiar schedules. The next, ports received cargo and corpses in the same holds. The route traced commerce. Grain ships and merchant caravans moved from the Nile Delta and Red Sea links to the Aegean, and from there to the Bosporus. Constantinople's density, dock workers, clerks, sailors, soldiers, gave the pathogen a perfect ladder. Markets stayed open because food had to move. Processions and councils kept calendars because government needed rhythm. That regular motion spread infection faster than officials could count. Crisis showed in the streets. Carts failed to keep pace with the dead. Burial teams dug trenches beyond the walls, then filled them and dug more. When space ran out, authorities stacked bodies inside towers and alongside stretches of fortification. Priests, magistrates, and physicians fell ill alongside laborers. Even the imperial household felt it. Justinian contracted the plague and nearly died. He recovered, but those close to him noted slower decisions, sharper suspicions, and a court that closed ranks. The demographic shock hit every system at once. Contemporary estimates suggest losses that, in some regions, erased up to half the population. Fields lacked hands, sowing schedules slipped, harvests shrank, and granaries ran light. Tax lists thinned, audits found empty homesteads, and collectors faced communities that could not meet quotas. Muster rolls showed gaps. Units merged to keep banners in the field, but veterans' losses hollowed experience, and recruitment pulled boys into ranks earlier than planned. On maps, villages vanished from later records because they never recovered. Military strain followed. The reconquered West had promised revenue and pride, yet it now demanded ships, garrisons, and subsidies that outpaced returns. African estates revolted. Italian towns changed hands when pay failed, and frontier posts reported shortages. Meanwhile, long-standing rivals tested the edges. Persian forces pressed eastern provinces. Gothic leaders regrouped in the Alpennines. Slavic groups crossed the Danube into Balkan lands, settling in pockets the state could no longer patrol consistently. Money was the same story. Rebuilding after the Nika fires had already drawn on reserves. Western wars had consumed coin for sieges, fleets, and bonuses. Then, the plague removed workers, raised prices, and slowed trade. Contracts lapsed because contractors died. Workshops closed, and mints struggled to keep output steady without debasing standards. The arithmetic turned brutal. Fewer taxpayers, higher defense costs, and emergency spending to keep the capital supplied. Administrators improvised, but the center felt the drag. By the final years of Justinian's rule, the empire still looked formidable on ceremonial days. Triumphs rolled through the streets. The Hagia Sophia's dome still caught morning light. Yet beneath the surface, the machine ran hot. Lines of communication stretched thin, commanders quarreled over rations, and provincial governors wrote back asking for relief they rarely received. The state remained larger than its neighbors, but vulnerability crept into routine. After Justinian's death, successors inherited borders that could no longer be policed as planned. They ceded some ground by treaty, abandoned others by necessity, and concentrated resources where survival required it. Expansion gave way to triage. Over the next decades, wars, migrations, and new religious currents pushed the empire into choices that would reshape institutions and identity. For a time, one statistic captured the memory of 541. At the peak, Constantinople may have lost as many as 10,000 people per day, and officials ran out of burial ground, stacking bodies inside walls and in abandoned fort towers. By the early 600s, the empire carried scars from decades of spending and disease. Revenues lagged behind obligations, garrisons stretched across too many fronts, and politics in the capital cycled through coups and purges. That weakness invited pressure. Enemies read the ledgers correctly. The state looked large on maps, but thin in muscle. Provinces that once fed the budget now asked for help. Ports still handled grain and taxes, yet the surplus that paid for counterattacks had evaporated. In 610, Heraclius arrived from North Africa and took the throne amid that turbulence. He inherited empty treasuries, a demoralized army, and a war that no one in the palace could direct. Border commanders sent bleak reports. The general staff had no coherent plan. Across the frontier, Khosrow II moved quickly, confident that Byzantium would collapse under pressure. Heraclius faced a choice: accept losses and bargain, or rebuild capacity at speed. The Sassanid campaign advanced in layers. Persian forces overran fortresses in Mesopotamia and punched into Syria. Provincial capitals fell, supply depots changed hands, and local elites hedged bets by cutting deals with the invaders. Palestine followed, then the Nile provinces. Egypt's grain and customs revenue slipped from the imperial ledger, and with it, the margin that once funded fleets. In Anatolia, towns along key roads were sacked or garrisoned by Persian troops, cutting lines between the interior and the capital. Jerusalem's fall in 614 carried more than strategic weight. The city's capture signaled to Christians across the empire that holy places lay unprotected. The loss of the true cross as war booty struck at the core of imperial identity, which had tied God's favor to Roman order. Pilgrimage routes broke, monasteries emptied, and bishops in distant provinces wrote letters that read like laments. In Constantinople, processions turned from celebration to supplication. By 617, the crisis neared the Straits. Avars and Slavs pressed from the Balkans, while Persian armies probed western Anatolia. The capital faced siege threats by land and sea. Military pay fell into arrears. Heraclius lacked cash and time. He answered by reorganizing. He cut short expenses, restructured mint issues, and pledged church ornaments as collateral to raise bullion for soldier pay and supplies. He trimmed non-essential posts and shifted resources into mobile field armies. Then he gambled on offense. Rather than bleed on the defensive line near the Bosporus, he marched across Anatolia and struck into Persian territory. The move forced Khosrow to react. Heraclius built alliances with steppe powers and used mountain routes to avoid static strongholds. Campaign seasons stacked one after another. Winter marches, rapid strikes on depots, and raids that wrecked Persian logistics. He kept his army small enough to move and supplied it from captured stores. The pivot came in 627 near Nineveh. Heraclius lured the Persian field force into open battle and won by precision and endurance. The defeat shook the Sassanid elite. Khosrow II fell soon after to a palace revolt. With leadership broken, Persian garrisons negotiated withdrawal. Frontiers rolled back toward earlier lines as the two exhausted states sought terms. In 630, Heraclius escorted the True Cross back to Jerusalem. The act restored prestige and offered a narrative of deliverance, yet the victory masked strain. The treasury sat empty, the army needed rest and recruits, and the eastern provinces had lost people and farms. Recovery required time the empire would not receive. From the Arabian Peninsula, a new power gathered speed, and its first probes met border posts still counting losses from the last war. Medieval writers called Heraclius' campaign a miracle of leadership, because, by any measure, Byzantium should have died here, and did not. As Byzantium and Persia staggered out of years of war, a new force formed on their southern horizon. By the early 7th century, communities across the Arabian Peninsula unified under the message preached by the Prophet Muhammad. After his death, leadership passed to the caliphs, who organized resources, law, and command structures with speed. Their state fused belief with administration, tax systems, garrison towns, and judges traveling with armies. Against them stood an empire that had just bled itself to save its borders. Byzantium held great cities and famous walls, but it was overstretched, cash poor, and short on veterans. The balance shifted quickly. Arab armies moved with coordinated columns, drawing on camel-borne logistics that crossed deserts Roman maps treated as barriers. They targeted nodes, not just open ground, river crossings, depots, and provincial capitals. The Byzantine field force at Yarmouk in 636 broke under pressure after days of maneuver on unfavorable terrain. With Syria lost, local revenues, recruitment bases, and a corridor to Mesopotamia vanished from imperial reach. Egypt followed soon after. Control of the Nile's grain and the customs of Alexandria slipped from Constantinople's ledgers, removing the safety valve that had cushioned shortages for centuries. Over the next decades, pressure rolled west along the coastlines. Exarchates struggled to fund fleets while desert flanks remained exposed. North Africa, with its estates, ports, and oil-producing hinterlands, moved into the orbit of the Caliphate. This was not only acreage changing hands, it was the empire's agricultural and fiscal core draining away. Workshops reliant on Egyptian papyrus and Eastern trade closed. Garrison payrolls fell behind. The capital still shone, but the budget that sustained it shrank. The Umayyad Caliphate then tested the center itself. Between 674 and 678, Arab fleets and armies established bases along the Sea of Marmara and pressed the capital by season. Constantinople, ringed by water and walls, endured bombardment and blockade. Supply by sea became the difference between endurance and collapse. The defenders deployed a new weapon, Greek fire, projected from bronze siphons mounted on ships and battlements. Its flames clung to hulls and spread across waves, breaking formations and burning crews who could not douse it. The siege unraveled, and the attackers withdrew. The struggle resumed on a larger scale in 717 and 718. The Umayyads returned with an armada and a land army anchored on the Thracian shore. Emperor Leo III coordinated the defense, tightened rationing, and kept fleets in rotation to contest the straits. Winter punished the besiegers. Supply lines failed. Disease and hunger cut ranks. Greek fire struck again in night actions that shattered squadrons at anchor. By spring, the siege collapsed. The capital stood, and the frontier settled into a long war by raid and treaty rather than decisive invasion. That survival mattered far beyond the straits. The line held at Constantinople blocked an eastern route into Europe. It set limits that later politics and faith would inherit. The empire that emerged from these trials was smaller and more guarded. Command shifted toward mobile defense, fortified themes in Anatolia, and a navy designed to keep the lifeline to the capital open. Gold flowed more carefully. Soldiers farmed land in exchange for service, and policy aimed at endurance instead of grand reconquest. Byzantium had been wounded, but it learned the habits that would keep it alive. Here's a mind-blowing fact. Greek fire's formula stayed in one family's custody for generations, and enemy crews sometimes turned back at the sight of siphons alone. By the mid-7th century, the empire looked smaller, poorer, and stretched to its limits. Syria, Egypt, and much of North Africa had slipped away. Raids struck Anatolia and the Balkans in repeat seasons. The treasury paid more for defense while collecting less from emptied lands. Garrison towns that once drew support from distant provinces now had to fend for themselves. Collapse was a real risk, yet the state still had a core, Constantinople, a working navy, and the memory of organized rule. The response was structural, not cosmetic. Emperors reordered the map into themes, a framework that put military and civil power in the same hands at the regional level. Each theme was a command zone with strategos who answered directly to the capital. He managed local courts, tax collection, and frontier patrols, so decisions did not wait on slow couriers. The logic was speed and accountability. If an army had to muster, the same official who oversaw farms and roads could raise men, move grain, and repair bridges without jurisdictional fights. Soldiers received land grants tied to service. Families held plots on the condition that a man in each household turned out with arms when summoned. Over time, this service became hereditary, building a pool of trained fighters spread across the countryside. That arrangement cut costs for the treasury. Farmers who were soldiers fed themselves, kept their mounts and gear, and needed less cash from the center. State stipends still mattered, but the burden fell off the imperial payroll and onto the new military farming communities. The results changed incentives. When raiders crossed a pass, defenders stood up for their own fields. Units knew the terrain, the water sources, and the choke points. They could rally quickly because muster points were close, and orders moved through one office. Frontier forces became stubborn, local, and hard to dislodge. Large invasions still caused damage, but small and medium strikes met organized resistance instead of empty watchtowers. This system also stabilized daily life. With a strategos handling both law and defense, petty cases found quicker judgment, and road work did not wait for a distant ministry. Small towns rebuilt walls, reopened markets, and restarted workshops. As harvest normalized, population loss slowed, and then reversed in parts of Anatolia. The state still taxed, but collections aligned with the seasonal rhythm of farming families who knew their obligations and what protection they received in return. Identity shifted alongside administration. The state moved away from grand projects and toward durable routines. Latin faded from official use, while Greek became the language of orders, courts, and contracts. Church life set the public calendar, and bishops worked with regional commanders to coordinate relief in bad years and to support garrisons near shrines and monasteries. The empire looked less like Rome and more like a compact, disciplined commonwealth that prized survival. Thematic organization did not solve every problem. Court politics continued, and some commanders grew powerful enough to threaten the palace. Yet, the framework held through shocks and bought time. It lowered fixed military costs, increased response speed, and kept core provinces in imperial hands. From this leaner base, later rulers could bargain, rebuild fleets, and sponsor learning. The groundwork for revival lay in those farmer soldiers and their officers. Here's a mind-blowing fact. This system kept Byzantium alive against larger, richer rivals for centuries, and some historians rate it among the most efficient military administrative designs ever devised. As frontier raids slowed and local armies settled into the thematic rhythm, a different kind of battle opened inside churches and homes. The argument was not over land, but what sacred images meant and whether they belonged in worship at all. Families had icons hanging near doorways and lampstands. Processions carried painted panels through streets on feast days. Emperors sent gifts of images to monasteries as signs of favor. These habits made icons part of daily piety and public life. Icons mattered because people treated them as points of contact. A believer could kiss a painted Christ or the Virgin, light a candle, or ask for intercession before a saint's image. Priests held them up over the sick. Soldiers wore small images into campaigns. The visuals taught doctrine to those who could not read and organized memory around faces, gestures, and scenes. For many, removing them would feel like tearing pages out of the faith's living book. Yet critics doubted that relationship. They worried that veneration blurred into worship and that paint and wood distracted attention from God. Military defeats against a rising Islamic caliphate, which banned religious imagery, sharpened the question. If an icon-free rival prospered while Byzantium struggled, some asked whether divine favor required purging images. The debate moved from sermons to palaces because policy could change what stood on church walls across the empire. Emperor Leo III, already known for defending the capital, pushed the issue into law around 726. Orders went out to take down icons from public places and sanctuaries. Officials replaced them with crosses or plain decoration. The policy gained a name, Iconoclasm, and it split communities. Iconoclasts argued they protected true worship and curbed superstition. Iconodules answered that honor paid to an image passed to the person depicted, and that the incarnation itself justified portraying Christ in matter. The fracture ran through neighborhoods and families. Bishops issued conflicting rulings. City crowds rioted when favorite images were removed. Monasteries turned into organizing centers for resistance, not only because monks produced icons, but because monastic teaching defended their role in prayer. The state responded with exile orders, seizures of monastic lands, and trials that targeted vocal defenders. Altarpieces disappeared. Frescoes were scraped from apses. The loss left a generation with blank walls where theology had once been painted. Imperial will did not remain constant. After periods of destruction, a change on the throne could relax policies. Then, a new ruler could enforce removal again. Over a century, this back and forth created cycles of rebuilding and erasure. The uncertainty trained artists to work in subtler modes and pushed some craftsmen to neighboring regions where patrons still commissioned icons. In 787, Empress Irene gathered bishops for a council at Nicaea. They affirmed that icons held a proper place in worship, that veneration differed from worship, and that images instructed the faithful. For a time, churches restored panels and mosaics, but the peace did not hold. Iconoclasm returned under later emperors, and only in 843 did a final settlement take hold. The restoration of icons became the Triumph of Orthodoxy, an annual celebration that marked the resolution as part of the empire's religious calendar. The repercussions reached far. Artistic styles developed with new caution and then with renewed confidence. The controversy pushed theologians to define how matter could mediate holiness. It also widened distance with the Latin West, where images remained less contested, and papal backing for icons intensified mistrust. Some believers protected treasures through the worst years by walling them up, hiding them in cellars, or sewing small images into garments to carry them safely across city gates. Basil I's story begins far from court. He worked as a stable hand and bodyguard before sharp instincts and physical skill pulled him into elite circles. Through patronage and marriage ties, he rose to the throne in 867 and set the tone for a dynasty that prized order, method, and steady gains. His ascent signaled a break from crisis management toward planned recovery. The palace professionalized, ministries received clearer mandates, and the army took its cues from leaders who intended to keep victories, not just win them. This stretch of rule is often called the Macedonian Renaissance. The label fits because institutions regained rhythm, generals improved the borders, and culture advanced on several fronts at once. Emperors from Basil I through his successors centralized decision-making, disciplined tax collection, and asserted control over provincial magnates who had grown rich from wartime disruption. The result was fewer private fiefdoms and a state with enough leverage to move grain, silver, and soldiers where they were needed. Law and administration received special attention. Compilers reorganized legislation into accessible handbooks, clarifying procedures for judges and governors who had worked from scattered edicts. Training for officials emphasized record-keeping, standardized contracts, and audit trails. With clearer rules, disputes moved faster and corruption faced tighter checks. The court also refined ceremonies, using processions and investitures to reinforce hierarchy and teach provincial envoys how authority operated. A stronger framework helped the economy rebound. Agricultural estates in Asia Minor expanded output with irrigation repairs and new settlements. Tax registers stabilized as migrants returned to cultivated zones under secure garrisons. Artisans in Constantinople and Thessaloniki produced silk, jewelry, glass, and military equipment, feeding a trade system that linked the Aegean to the Black Sea and the Levant. Merchants moved cargo under safer sea lanes, and coinage circulated with reliable weight, encouraging savings and credit. Learning followed prosperity. Scholars copied and commented on classical Greek texts, keeping the language precise and the canon intact. Works of Homer, Aristotle, Plato, and Euclid re-entered classrooms in corrected versions, while scribes produced multiple exemplars that passed into monasteries and private libraries. Compilers assembled encyclopedic collections, anthologies of rhetoric, and handbooks for statecraft that shaped how students argued, wrote, and governed. Prose tightened, arguments became more structured, and authors aimed for clarity over ornament. Art and architecture matured into a distinct, confident style. Icon painters refined faces and gestures into calm, luminous forms designed for prayer rather than spectacle. Mosaicists laid gold grounds that caught candlelight and defined sacred space, using disciplined geometry to frame figures with balance and hierarchy. Churches multiplied, their domes set on sturdy piers, interiors lined with marble revetments, and floors cut in patterned stone that guided movement from narthex to nave. Power projected outward through careful diplomacy and military campaigns. Field armies, supported by the Thematic base, pressed advantages in the Balkans along the eastern frontier, while envoys negotiated marriages and tribute arrangements that extended influence without constant occupation. Religious missions traveled with this policy. In the Slavic lands, teachers introduced liturgy in the local tongue and devised scripts that made translation stable. From this work grew the Cyrillic tradition and a Christian Kievan Rus, which aligned elites with Byzantine rites and aesthetics. By the mid-10th century, the capital wrote with assurance, minted with confidence, and sent orders across seas and passes expecting compliance. The Macedonian era rebuilt a coherent identity centered on Orthodox worship, Greek learning, and imperial continuity. Basil II steps onto the throne without fanfare and without patience for glamour. He cuts out the fluff of court life, wears plain gear, and keeps his household lean. He eats like a soldier, drills like one, and spends his best years sleeping under canvas. Anyone looking for a court showman finds a commander who counts coin, rations grain, and watches the frontiers more closely than he watches the banquets. His early years are a fight inside the empire. Great landholding families in Anatolia treat provinces like private estates and officers like clients. Their wealth buys retinues, Their web of marriages buys influence, and their aim bends towards autonomy. Basil meets them with investigations, confiscations, and marching orders. He breaks their estates, moves loyal governors into key districts, and makes sure the tax registers answer to the palace. Rebellions flare. He does not bargain them down. He surrounds, isolates, and pulls their leaders out of the chain of command. By the time the dust settles, the emperor's word reaches the villages again. With the house put in order, Basil turns to the war that will define him. The Bulgarian Empire holds strong positions in the Balkans, with fortresses strung across passes and rivers. The fighting is slow and heavy. Campaign seasons grind across ridgelines, through ravines, and around stone walls that must be starved, not stormed. Basil studies maps, rotates garrisons, and leans on engineers. Supply depots anchor his advances. New forts lock down roads after each push. He does not chase glory with single battles. He applies pressure year after year until the Bulgarian line begins to thin. The campaign hardens both sides. Columns creep through mountain fog, scouts test crossings, and winter closes in before pay chests do. Basil accepts the pace because it suits his method. He pulls allies where possible, but relies on discipline, steady logistics, and a habit of returning to the field even after a tough season. The war becomes the rhythm of his reign. In 1014, at Kladion, patience pays. Basil traps a large Bulgarian force in a narrow valley. His troops block exits, cut the slopes with obstacles, and press from the front. The collapse yields thousands of prisoners. His order is blunt: blind them, sparing 1 in 100 with a single eye to lead the rest home. When the broken columns reach their ruler, Tsar Samuel, the shock kills him. From that day, the name that spreads with Basil is the Bulgar Slayer. The resistance bends. Fortresses capitulate. Basil folds Bulgaria into the imperial structure, sending officials to take oaths, count fields, and enroll soldiers. The borders stretch from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. Customs posts along rivers add new revenue. Garrison towns along the Danube fill with veterans. Patrols on the frontier find more quiet than trouble. The treasury grows under strict accounting. Provinces remit taxes on time. The army stays drilled, paid, and rotated, with units seasoned by long campaigns. Threats on other fronts test the borders, but the lines hold. For the first time in centuries, the empire's map looks confident. Basil leaves a state that is wealthy, orderly, and feared. He leaves no equal to replace him. After his death, courtiers return to games, and successors lean on the system he built without his steel to guard it. The edges begin to fray. For all that, the measure of his rule stands: hard iron, long patience, and a will that kept marching. He spent so much time in the field that the gilded halls might as well have been foreign soil to him. Basil II's death in 1025 left a full treasury, a drilled army, and borders held by fortresses he had secured. But the strength of that system depended on his vigilance. Without his oversight, the court relaxed. Successors spent more time on ceremonies, entourages, and favors than on rosters and supply lines. Palaces grew busy, barracks grew quiet. Senior posts went to favorites instead of hardened officers. The habits that kept the frontiers steady began to slip. As courtiers competed, great families in Anatolia pressed their advantage. They bought out small holders, absorbed village plots, and stretched their estates across valleys that had once sustained soldier farmers. With land came jurisdiction. Local judges and tax officials answered to magnates, not the capital. The state's grip on recruitment weakened. Men who had served as part-time cavalry in the themes drifted off the rolls, or showed up under a lord's banner instead of the imperial eagle. Files thinned. Musters came up short. To fill gaps, emperors hired muscle. Contracts went to Normans from the west, Pecheneg riders from the steppe, and Turkic auxiliaries adept with horse archery. They could fight, but they fought for coin. Delayed pay meant desertion. A richer offer meant defection. Commanders learned to keep a chest close at hand and an eye on the camp gate. Meanwhile, the treasury lost depth. As aristocrats ring-fenced estates, taxable land shrank. Court projects, stipends, and gifts rose faster than revenue. Auditors found more exemptions than assessments. Abroad, pressure mounted. In southern Italy, Norman adventurers tested Byzantine garrisons and pried towns from imperial governors. In the Balkans, Pecheneg raids burned fields and pulled captives across the Danube. Most dangerous of all were the Seljuk Turks, whose raids cut into eastern Anatolia. Their mobility exposed the empire's slower, understrength units. Raiding seasons pushed deeper each year, interrupting planting and trade and turning frontier cities into nervous islands. Politics turned erratic. Generals with a taste for power made bids for the throne. Ministers built factions, traded bribes, and switched loyalties when the wind changed. The palace answered coups with coups. A ruler crowned in spring might be deposed, blinded, or shipped to a monastery by winter. Each turnover pushed experienced officials out and brought uncertain hands in. Orders conflicted. Tax policy changed mid-year, and provincial governors hedged their bets, waiting to see who ruled next month. The army felt the confusion most. Senior officers reshuffled with each regime change, plans were rewritten, and long-term fortification programs stalled. Units that once trained together dispersed to protect nobles' lands or sat idle awaiting clear commands. On campaign, coordination broke down. Scouts arrived late, wagons lagged, and small defeats multiplied into retreats. Soldiers paid late, fed poorly, and led by strangers lost the confidence that had defined Basil's ranks. By the 1060s, the maps still looked respectable and the titles still sounded grand. But the pillars were hollowing. The themes no longer produced steady cavalry. The mercenary corps demanded silver the state struggled to raise, and the frontier population bore the cost of raids that commanders could not stop. When Romanos IV came to power, he inherited resources, fortresses, and a name that still carried weight. He also inherited a court split by rivalries, officers bound to patrons, and an army that looked strong in ledgers, yet moved like a body out of practice. 13 emperors in 46 years had left scars that numbers could not hide. Romanos IV Diogenes took the purple with a clear goal: restore order in the ranks and stop the Seljuk advance slicing into Anatolia. He knew where the empire breathed. Anatolia supplied the men who filled the regiments, the grain that fed them, the horses that moved them, and the taxes that kept the system alive. If the high plateau slipped away, the empire's core would crack. He set out to rebuild field discipline, audit musters, and put a general's eye back on the eastern roads. He gathered a large army, but the force reflected the politics of the time. They were dependable tagmata and provincial units used to marching in formation. Mixed among them stood mercenaries under contract, local levies mustered on short notice, and foreign contingents whose loyalty followed paymasters. The roster looked impressive. The cohesion was uneven. Romanos tried to shape them into a single engine with drills, clear routes, and stockpiled supplies. He needed a wind that would stiffen spines and warn the tribes crossing the frontier. Across the line stood Alp Arslan, a commander who preferred movement to spectacle. He kept his cavalry light, his scouts active, and his battles on his terms. His riders cut at foragers, pulled advance guards into false chases, and pressed only when the ground and timing favored them. He avoided pitched combat until he saw an opening he could widen. That habit turned Byzantine caution into overreach. In 1071, the imperial host reached Manzikert, near Lake Van, aiming to take fortresses, secure passes, and draw the Seljuks into a fight they could not refuse. The staff work assumed predictable opposition. It misread the speed of Seljuk detachments and the reach of their patrols. Skirmishes nipped at the columns, signals grew confused. Orders to concentrate mixed with orders to scout further, and units drifted away from one another. The fault line widened inside the command tent. Andronicus Ducas, a general with his own interests at court, distrusted the emperor and the campaign. During the critical phase, as the center pressed forward and the wings tried to hold, he pulled his reserve back. The withdrawal opened the gap and stripped Romanus of his safety net. What looked like a measured advance turned into exposure. Seljuk horse archers flowed into the space, circling the Byzantine line and showering it with arrows. They probed for weak points, shut down retreat paths, and kept the infantry turning instead of moving. Dust, noise, and conflicting commands broke formation. Once the rear felt pressure and the flanks wavered, the line collapsed by sections. Romanos fought with the guard but found himself isolated, his banner surrounded. He was taken alive. Alp Arslan did not stage a spectacle of vengeance. He treated the captive emperor with formal respect, set terms that the treasury could meet, and released him. The campaign, however, lay in ruins. Romanos returned to the capital where rivals had prepared their move. They deposed him, ordered his blinding, and sent him into exile. A soldier emperor who had sought to steady the frontier fell to palace arithmetic. The field loss at Manzikert broke more than a campaign plan. Control over the Anatolian interior unraveled. Turkish tribes moved in, settled, and stitched new routes across the plateau. With recruitment grounds cut and tax districts lost, the imperial machine lost its balance and momentum. In less than a decade, central Anatolia slipped from Byzantine hands, a region held for centuries. The date stands as a pivot in medieval warfare and in the story of an empire's long decline. The treasury was thin, and warlords, foreign raiders, and ambitious courtiers split the empire's attention. Provinces still showed imperial colors, but garrisons lacked pay and orders, and the roads into the capital carried more petitions than grain. That is the world Alexios I Komnenos walked into in 1081, taking the throne with a promise to stabilize the heart of the state before the shell cracked apart. Alexios started by tightening command. He folded scattered offices back under the palace, trimmed overlapping authorities, and placed trustworthy kin and veterans where decisions moved too slowly. Army roles were purged of ghost names, and commanders who owed rank to flattery instead of service were replaced. He rebuilt the field forces around reliable core units and attached lighter, faster contingents to harass enemies who had learned to avoid set-piece fights. Fortresses guarding the approaches to the capital received repairs, fresh garrisons, and supply depots that could hold out when campaigns went wrong. Money powered everything. So he reworked revenue. Tax exemptions that nobles had treated as hereditary perks were reviewed, narrowed, or canceled. Inspectors counted estates that had expanded quietly during years of chaos, bringing acreage back onto the registers. Customs officers were rotated and audited. Revenue that once fed court pensions and pageantry moved toward barracks, shipyards, and magazines along the straits. The goal was simple: cash first to units that could stop a raid from becoming a migration. Alexios used diplomacy like a campaign plan. He balanced enemies against each other, cut deals with one threat to counter another, and bought time wherever he could. When pressure along the front exceeded what his reorganized army could manage, he looked west for help, seeking limited contingents to shore up Anatolian routes and coastal towns. The appeal reached churchmen and princes who answered with a movement far larger than he expected. The flood of crusading armies was unruly, but it could be steered. Through oaths and logistics, Alexios extracted recoveries along the Aegean Rim and in western Anatolia, bringing ports and key road hubs back into the imperial network. His son, John II Komnenos, kept the machine steady rather than flashy. He led careful campaigns that cleared threats along frontiers, reinforced alliances that worked, and refused overreach. Garrisons stayed supplied, fort lines were maintained, and the bureaucracy delivered funds with fewer lapses. Stability, not spectacle, defined his years, and the map looked safer because of it. Manuel I Komnenos pushed outward with more ambition. He tested imperial weight in the Balkans, negotiated with Italian powers while pressuring them at sea, and sought influence in the eastern Mediterranean through both arms and marriages. Planning grew more complex, fleets grew busier, and embassies multiplied. The court shone again, not in empty display, but in scholarship, ceremony, and an economy that hummed with trade crossing the harbors. Caravans met convoys, artisans filled markets, and the capital sold protection and prestige as well as goods. Yet the Restoration had limits. It leaned on strong rulers making constant adjustments, on allies that needed incentives, and on a military rebuilt for resilience more than conquest. When Manuel died, the balances he kept began to wobble. Factions resurfaced, rivals circled, and partners abroad watched for openings. As Crusader states shifted, Venice grew bolder. The empire's margin for error narrowed in the very waters that had enriched Constantinople and made it the city travelers called the richest on earth. Alexios I asked for professional contingents, supply contracts, and shipping to help retake the fortified towns that anchored western Anatolia. What arrived in 1096 was a mass movement of lords, knights, and camp followers driven by vows and relics, not by Byzantine plans. They crossed imperial lands on their own timetables, answered to their own commanders, and bargained hard at every gate. Alexios made them swear oaths where he could, mapped their routes, and used escorts to keep order, but the scale ensured friction from the first crossing of the Bosporus. Once in the Levant, the Crusaders operated as independent coalitions. They negotiated with local powers, fought over plunder, and placed garrisons in cities they considered prizes of faith. Byzantine officers expected the return of former imperial towns after capture. Crusading leaders judged commitments case by case. That mismatch set the tone. Campaign by campaign, they stood side by side against common foes, then quarreled over who held the keys afterward. Mutual suspicion deepened with every interaction. Imperial diplomats read the armies from the west as unpredictable, brave in assault, loose in discipline, quick to draw swords in markets or monasteries. Western chroniclers, in turn, describe Byzantine officers as skilled at postponement, too smooth in negotiation, and more focused on tariffs and treaties than on battlefield zeal. Both claimed to guard Christianity. Both kept counting the other's ships and tallies. Even with the strain, Byzantium gained early. Coastal strongholds in Asia Minor returned to the imperial network. Harbors reopened to tax commerce. Roads from the Aegean to the plateau could be patrolled and supplied again. The belt of cities along the coast fed revenue into the arsenal and paid for garrisons that watched the interior. For a time, the frontier steadied. Later crusading waves complicated every gain. Lords from the Latin states pressed beyond what imperial charters allowed, keeping fortresses they had sworn to hand back and issuing their own grants over farmland once logged in Byzantine registers. Appeals and arbitrations dragged while walls were reinforced and new settlers arrived. Each delay hardened facts on the ground. Meanwhile, Venice rose from partner to rival. Early in Alexios's reign, the empire traded wide customs exemptions for naval muscle. Venetian convoys secured sea lanes and escorted troop ships, but their privileges multiplied. Quays, warehouses, and entire street grids in the capital fell under Venetian jurisdiction. Their courts handled disputes inside those districts, tolls shrank for their cargo, and profits flowed north across the Adriatic. By mid-century, Venice could blockade or supply the straits on its own terms. Inside the empire, stability slipped. Imperial succession reopened factional scores, and ministries turned over with each new patronage network. Commanders leaned harder on hired companies, Norman lancers, steppe horsemen, and Italian mariners, whose contracts drained coin and whose loyalties followed arrears notices. Every crisis demanded cash first, policy second. Diplomacy became a puzzle with moving edges. Envoys shuttled between Crusader courts, Venetian councils, Norman princes in southern Italy, and powers in Egypt and Syria. One agreement often jeopardized another. A treaty that secured a convoy risked angering a land ally. A pledge to a Latin prince might undercut a Byzantine claim to a city. By the late 1100s, the fabric of cooperation was thin. Grievances piled up, unpaid debts, broken oaths, seizures of docks, arrests of merchants. Trust gave way to calculation. The empire had survived sieges, pandemics, and border collapses by managing enemies. Now the danger gathered inside its trade routes and harbors, in the hands of those who sailed under the cross, yet bargained like conquerors. Venetian merchants controlled entire districts of Constantinople, with their own markets and courts, a city within the city, waiting for a spark. The Fourth Crusade was signed to sail against Egypt, a rich target that could undercut Ayyubid power and open the road to Jerusalem. It never reached the Nile. Crusade leaders contracted with Venice for a massive fleet, shipwrights and sailors worked for months, and the bill came due on a day the armies could not meet it. Too few crusaders arrived, and those who did lacked the cash. The Republic saw leverage. If the crusade could not pay in coin, it could pay in service. That service would point toward Venetian interests. Debt set the route. Venice first redirected the host to attack Zara, a Christian rival on the Adriatic, to cover part of the arrears. From there, the expedition drifted from papal intent to commercial calculus. Meanwhile, Byzantine politics cracked open a larger opportunity. In exile was a young claimant, Alexios Angelos, who promised the Crusade and Venice a package that solved everything on paper: money to clear the debt, troops to support their campaigns, and church union to ease friction with Rome. All he needed was the throne of his deposed father restored in Constantinople. The army and fleet set a course for the Bosporus. After bombardments and assaults along the sea walls, the current regime buckled, and Alexios was crowned alongside his blind father as Alexios IV. The Crusaders waited for payment. The new emperor searched for funds he did not control, tried to raise taxes in a hostile city, and found that imperial treasuries were not bottomless chests. Weeks stretched into months. Grain prices spiked, coin was minted with reduced silver, and guards clashed with Latin detachments over supplies and lodgings. Tension filled the streets. Greek-speaking crowds saw foreign soldiers quartered in monasteries and warehouses. Latin merchants demanded protection and priority at the docks. Fires broke out after brawls. Rumors of plots raced through both camps. The court splintered again. A coup removed Alexios IV and replaced him with a ruler unwilling to pay or tolerate the Latin presence. The Crusaders now stood in front of the greatest walled city in the Mediterranean with no money, no sponsor at court, and no safe exit. The calculation narrowed to a single option. In April 1204, they attacked. Venetian ships with boarding bridges seized sections of the sea walls. Assault parties forced gates, fires spread through districts as defenders fell back, and breaches widened under repeated pushes. The Theodosian walls, symbols of centuries of sieges endured, failed under division inside and coordinated strikes outside. Once the defenses broke, order vanished. The sack lasted 3 days. Churches were stripped, relics and icons were pulled down, libraries and scriptoria burned. Palaces were emptied of plate, textiles, and mosaics pried from their settings. House by house, valuables changed hands. Families were dragged into slavery. Thousands died in the streets or in sanctuaries that could not protect them. Barges and wagons loaded treasures bound for Venetian quays. The cultural loss could not be counted. Manuscripts that linked late antique scholarship to the present vanished. Reliquaries and chalices crossed the Adriatic, many to rest in Venetian churches. Bronze horses that stood above the hippodrome were taken and mounted at St. Mark's. On the ruins, the conquerors declared a Latin empire, dividing lands and offices. Byzantine elites escaped to Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, where rival courts claimed continuity and plotted return. The blow was structural. Wealth that funded fleets and stipends was gone. Prestige collapsed with the plunder of the capital. Even after a Byzantine restoration decades later, the empire returned smaller, poorer, and dependent on powers that had just sacked its heart. Many medieval observers marked 1204, not 1453, as the moment Byzantium lost its core, its art, and its identity. By the mid-1400s, the Byzantine Empire had narrowed to Constantinople and a few coastal holdings and fortresses. Trade had thinned, tax districts had vanished, and the court governed a capital surrounded by a rising Ottoman power. The city's defenses still stood on their ancient lines, but the empire behind them was a memory. Centuries of war, disrupted revenue, and dynastic failures had reduced a superpower to a walled enclave. Mehmed II, young and determined, took the Ottoman throne with a plan that joined strategy to symbolism. Constantinople controlled the straits, promised customs revenue, and sat between the empire's Balkan and Anatolian lands. Conquering it would also claim the legacy of Rome. He reorganized administration, secured supply lines to the siege area, and brought in artisans, miners, and engineers to build what earlier armies lacked: heavy, sustained firepower that could break stone instead of waiting it out. The Ottoman host gathered with discipline. Janissaries formed the professional corps, drilled for assaults and counterattacks. Provincial levies dug trenches, dragged fascines, and kept a constant flow of materials to the front. Artillery crews prepared bombards and smaller guns to batter towers and curtain walls. Most striking was a giant cannon, cast from metal thick enough to withstand repeated discharges, capable of hurling massive stone balls that fractured masonry and shook foundations with each impact. Facing this was Constantine XI Paleologos. He had few men, fewer resources, and no illusion about the odds. Still, he refused withdrawal offers and stayed at the walls, organizing sectors, setting schedules, and sharing risk with Italian captains and local units. His stance turned the defense into a statement: protect the city's people and its memory, even if relief fleets never arrived and treaties offered only delay. The siege opened with encirclement by land and the blocking of the harbor exits by sea. The Theodosian walls, triple-layered lines that had stopped generations of enemies, were cracked by time and thinly manned. Defenders numbered only a few thousand: Greek soldiers, Genoese and Venetian volunteers, and armed townspeople. They patched rubble with timber and earth, hauled stones back into place, and rotated through bombardment under a schedule that strained every hour of daylight. Artillery dictated the tempo. Week after week, bombardment widened chips into breaches. Mining teams tried to collapse sections. Counterminers listened for picks and answered with fires and cave-ins. Night sorties spiked ladders and burned mantlets. Daylight returned to drums and gunfire. Food stretched, morale wavered and steadied, and envoys shuttled without producing terms either side could accept. Before dawn on May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched a layered assault. Irregulars tested gaps, drawing missiles and tiring the line. Better troops followed, pressing at the weakest points while artillery renewed its pounding. Finally, Janissaries advanced in ordered waves. A gate sector gave, a banner fell, and formations broke into the city's streets. Fighting surged around intersections, churches, and barricades. Constantine XI died in the crush, still in armor, and was never securely identified among the dead. Once resisted collapsed, Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia and ordered its conversion into a mosque. The city changed hands and purpose in a single procession. After more than 11 centuries, the Byzantine Empire ended. With the fall of Constantinople, Rome's last remnant closed its account. Yet Orthodox tradition, art, architecture, diplomacy, and the books scholars carried out would keep shaping other states and cultures. Many of those scholars reached Italian cities with manuscripts and methods that fed a movement already stirring, one that marked the end of the medieval world and the start of another. And that was the rise, glory, decline, and final fall of the Byzantine Empire, a civilization that carried the flame of Rome for more than 1,000 years. If you enjoyed this journey through history, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of the past.